Migrant labor camps are everywhere in the United States. There are literally thousands of places labeled as such. Plenty of these so-called camps provide decent housing, education, and other basic functions. However, many of them do not meet standards set by the current regulations. The infrastructure of this system provides a template for the exploitation of any vulnerable population. Isolation, a lack of sufficient oversight, and much more has resulted in all too many instances where the people who help feed America are not treated like people at all.
In 1960, CBS journalist Edward Murrow's documentary titled Harvest of Shame exposed these systemic issues. The film documented the lives of migrant workers and their families across various migrant labor camps on the east coast of the United States. It revealed the poor living and working conditions they faced, including shoddy housing with rats eating away at the beds. A reverend who worked with the migrants said that most of the crew leaders who employ the workers are the worst they can be and are trying to skin them alive, taking every dime they make through any scheme necessary. The documentary was aired on Thanksgiving with intentions to shock America into action. In 1964, the Farm Labor Contractor Registration Act was passed. However, in 1968, an episode of Net Journal, What Harvest for the Reaper, exposed the reality that not much had actually changed. This film documented migrant labor camps in Cutchogue, New York. The featured crew leader, Andrew Anderson, recruited workers from even more exploited areas just to trap them in perpetual debt servitude, starting with the first bus fare. One scene even showed an ill-tempered Anderson threatening to kill a defiant worker over a small debt. The film also featured interviews with the men who own the camps, who made it clear they believe they're somehow the ones being taken advantage of by the workers, or even that they're instead being taken advantage of by their own kind. Overall, What Harvest for the Reaper made it quite obvious the corrupt system remained. Due to increased awareness resulting from the films and farm labor movements of the time, along with growing criticism of the FLCRA, the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Workers Protection Act was passed in 1983 and was largely a revision of the FLCRA. But agricultural workers are still excluded from the National Labor Relations Act and Fair Labor Standards Act. These acts include protections for minimum wage, overtime, unionizing, and collective bargaining. The MSPA remains largely unchanged today. However, the new legislation is severely flawed too. It too lacks these critical protections for farm workers' rights to unionizing and collective bargaining, making enforcement much less likely. And, in fact, many employers have continuously violated the act in the years since its passage. Repeat offenders make up the majority of violators, with just 5% of farms accounting for between 50 to 85% of MSPA violations. Between 2000 and 2019, there were roughly $25 million in civil penalties for violations, with about $10 million in back wages recovered. Those are drops in the bucket for an industry worth billions. Some states like California have passed their own stricter regulations in response to the lack of federal action, but critics still report issues like underfunding and poor enforcement. Others have done the opposite and passed legislation attacking farm worker rights. For example, North Carolina's Farm Act of 2017 restricted collective bargaining agreements, but this provision was blocked by a federal court in 2018 and was eventually ruled unconstitutional. In 2024, the DOL published their Farm Worker Protection Final Rule. It aims to strengthen protection for farm workers, but the DOL has been barred from enforcement in 17 states by a Georgia judge's injunction following a lawsuit filed by these states. In general, the continual violations and pattern of poor enforcement across all levels of government suggests current legislation may be much the same as before. Legal groundwork lacking material impact. To get a better understanding of how the systemic failures actually unfold, let's unpack a federal case that I think exemplifies the nature of the current system. In 2005, workers at a labor camp in East Palatka, Florida, contacted the Coalition of Immokalee Workers to report abuses including forced labor. The CIW notified federal authorities, who then raided the camps. What they uncovered is arguably one of the most disturbing labor schemes ever. The labor camp was located past no trespassing signs and barbed wire fences on a small plot of land off a remote dirt road. The man in charge was a Mr. Ronald Robert Evans Sr., who had been investigated multiple times by federal and state agencies for farm labor-related violations. Trial witnesses testified that Evans Sr. and his co-defendants operated the camps so as to extract as much value as possible from groups of homeless people. For many years, they recruited workers from homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and other low-income areas across the southeast U.S. They charged their workers $50 a week for room and board, and paid them minimum or less than minimum wage for difficult field labor. Every weekday, they gave the workers the opportunity to buy crack, beer, and cigarettes at an on-site company store. They charged them inflated prices and deducted all purchases from their paychecks. Advances of crack were also available on payday. One worker told NPR that all advances he took had to be paid back at 100% interest. In order to have access to the cash necessary to purchase large amounts of drugs, the defendants and their farmer clients engaged in a financial restructuring scheme that allowed checks from the farmers to be cashed without triggering reporting requirements. Multiple workers also reported being prevented from leaving the camps. Evans Sr. was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison, but was put on home confinement during COVID, and ultimately was granted clemency by the Biden administration in 2024. Evans Sr. also had a boss. He worked for Tater Farms, which was owned by the late Frank Johns. In 2007, Johns was the chairman of the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association's Budget and Finance Committee and served on their mutual insurance company's board of directors for over 20 years. He praised Evans Sr. as an above-average crew leader to the press, even after charges were filed. Imagine the below-average crew leaders, if such is true. The CIW has said that this case constitutes an unconscionable exploitation that took place on a former FFVA chairman's farm, which brings into question the complicity of those at the top of the industry. That is one of the main takeaways from this case. People like Evans Sr. are of course guilty of horrendous crimes and deserve to be punished. But there's a serious lack of the same sentiment within these systems for those above the people like Evans Sr. This case was part of discussions in a 2008 Senate hearing chaired by Bernie Sanders titled Ending Abuses and Improving Conditions for Tomato Workers. This hearing discussed several recent cases involving farm worker slavery, abuse, and exploitation. The most recent was a case in January of 2008, which included allegations of workers being beaten, chained to poles, trapped inside U-Hauls, kicked, slapped, threatened, and kept in perpetual debt or forced to work for free. Investigative reporter Eric Schlosser acknowledged during the hearing that these are crimes you would expect to happen in 1868, not 2008. Collier County trafficking detective Charlie Frost said that instances of slavery like these cases are almost assuredly happening right now. The director of the Immigrant Justice Project, Mary Bauer, told Senator Sanders that there is clearly an industry culture that facilitates these sorts of crimes. The executive vice president of the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange, Reggie Brown, also spoke. Concerning the allegations of slavery, abuse, and more, Brown stated that these are all crimes under laws that their growers comply with, and that they abhor and condemn slavery. Sanders' closing statement was as follows: "We are likely to need to expand protections for workers in a number of ways, including adding coverage of both the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act to agricultural workers. Finally, we need to make sure that slavery, servitude, and other abuses in the Florida tomato industry continue to receive the attention, both in and outside of Congress, that they deserve, with the goal of ending this abomination. Needless to say, slavery is not something which should exist in America in 2008, and, needless to say, the horrendous wage and working conditions that exist in that industry need to be significantly improved." This hearing may not have immediately led to legislative improvement, but it did the important job of creating a documented instance of the government acknowledging the issue and industry leaders denying it. Industry leaders will tell you that competitive pressure from large commercial operations and imported goods is what keeps wages low, but this ignores the industry's history of intentionally exploiting vulnerability. The FTGE did eventually sign agreements with the CIW in 2010, but only after sustained public pressure. This indicates the exploitation may have actually been an intentional choice over reform. A system like this only remains largely unchanged for over 60 years because it's more profitable than the alternative. So, what does all of this mean? It means that America has more or less successfully sanitized an industry laden with exploitation and abuse to seem completely innocent on its surface. Merely looking up migrant labor camps will lead you to mostly neutral information on housing and regulations. The public narrative surrounding the industry uses language that obscures systemic abuses, whether intentionally or not. This leaves you, at worst, completely unsuspecting of these sorts of issues, and at best, extremely confused. Evans Sr. proved that anybody could use the infrastructure of the current system to exploit any vulnerable population, not just migrants. In fact, the more vulnerable, the better. The ease with which people are able to exploit undocumented workers proves this. Their status prevents them from being able to report abuses without fear of deportation, fears which are only intensified by Trump's agenda of mass deportations. The CEO of the company that operates the Fort Bliss ICE detention camp even pleaded guilty in 2019 to hiring undocumented immigrants and concealing them from authorities. Corruption doesn't get much more blatant than that. The Trump administration also made changes to farmworker regulations in January this year that lowered minimum wages and allowed housing costs to be deducted from paychecks. Moreover, the current system does not do nearly enough to actively ensure atrocities are not taking place. So, what can you do about all this? You can support the expansion of the CIW's Fair Food program by donating or helping a local co-op, restaurant, or independent grocer join. Their work is invaluable, having freed over 1,200 people from modern-day slavery. They need all the help they can get to expand their reach, with just 21 states currently having participants. The FFP proves that individual choices do matter. But, unfortunately, there's still not enough. Real lasting change requires either dismantling the system as a whole and finding better labor solutions, or overhauling the system entirely from regulations to enforcement. So, educate yourself and others however you can. Systems like this thrive on invisibility. In 2008, farmworker slavery was treated as a scandal. This isn't merely a scandal. It's a political emergency. We must demand our elected officials treated as such and do whatever is necessary to finally stop these systems of exploitation.